Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zobrio University's webinar on using relative dates in financial statements in Financial Edge. Today we have Chuck Hayes, a Senior Application Consultant here at Zobrio to lead the webinar. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go over all of them at the end. Thank you, and I'll now hand it back over to Chuck.
Thanks so much, Colleen. And Colleen, I just want to verify you're seeing my slide presentation here, that is working.
Yes, no, that was good.
Okay, good. Okay, because it wasn't showing me on my side that was okay. Okay, excellent. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Chuck, and I'll be your tour guide today. So we want to talk about a really cool feature that, in my experience, is kind of underutilized inside the Financial Edge, or FE NXT, this concept of relative dates. So I will talk about what are they, where this come from, what this is all about, and then we'll take a look at some examples. It's a very easy setting to implement, but it can also be very powerful along the way. So what is a relative date? Well, before I answer that question, I want to give you a little backstory on this. So a relative date basically means I've got a column in a financial statement, and I've set it up to reference the last period, whatever that is. And I want to go back 2 years and do a comparison. Well, I don't want to keep changing the dates. So the relative date says, well, take that date and go back 2 years. That's basically what it is. But let me give you a backstory. So I used to work at Blackbaud. I was a principal consultant for Financial Edge for many, many years. And I was at Blackbaud when Fundware was acquired. And I'm not sure if any of you on the call were using Fundware, but we have a lot of customers who migrated from Fundware to the Financial Edge, or FE NXT. So I like to point out that after that acquisition, and then I learned Fundware while I was at Blackbaud and helped with implementations, that kind of thing, to Financial Edge. But the developers at Blackbaud took a look at Fundware and said, we need that feature. Fundware actually had the relative date feature already built in many, many, many years ago. And the developers said, okay, we need to add that to the Financial Edge. And they added it as a result of that acquisition, which is really kind of cool. So I thought that was a great example of learning from other systems, if you will. So again, a relative date is where you have a column in a financial statement, and we will look at examples. And you want to compare that column and go back a certain period of time. And again, the whole point is to save you the trouble of constantly changing dates inside reports, because I would suggest that 95% of the time, you could set up a report to just run based on your normal sequence of when you run it and not have to keep changing the dates. We'll look at which reports can use relative dates. So hint, hint, it's mostly the financial statements. And then we'll look at a few examples of relative dates in database view. And we're also starting to make sure we always look at web view. So many of our customers have migrated their on-premises FE7 database to the NXT view that's hosted by Blackbaud. So you still have what is now called database view, but web view is also available. It's a different presentation of the same information. But I especially like what happens with reports. So I will take you into a sample database Zobrio has and just make a couple comments about, okay, here's how the settings look for relative dates. And then also make a couple other comments about running reports when you're in web view. So I'm going to go into my little copy here of a sample database in what I'll refer to as database view, because that is the new language of this particular, or you can call it classic, if you will. So first of all, we're talking about reports in the general ledger where the feature is available. So let's start there. Secondly, it has to be a report that has configurable columns. And pretty much that's limited to the financial statement. So that's really what we're going to zero in on at this point. But let me go ahead and open up an example that I did. I'll do an income statement example. And for those of you that may not be familiar with all of the different kinds of settings that are associated with these complex income statements, I'll just highlight a few things, give you a little bit of an overview, and then we'll zero in specifically on this whole relative date situation. So in an income statement, basically the bulk of the settings really revolve around the columns. So this is a situation where we're going to see a list of account numbers, divided by revenue and expenses, or I've included another feature here that I'll explain separately. And then I'm going to list account numbers with their description, but then I'm going to have a column that is looking at a particular time frame. And then in this case, I've added another time frame. Now, if you take a look on the right-hand side, you get a clue to where this is going. So you'll see that right now, the system, this report will show the month of January of 2021, but also go back a year to 2020. Now that doesn't necessarily tell you the extent of the settings, but it does allow you to get a sense of, if I run this report right now, what dates are going to show up on this particular report. So I am adding a couple extra comments here just to orient folks who may not be familiar with all of these settings. So in this classic database view, to open a particular column, you actually click on a row. So I'm in a row to look at a column. I'm going to use the open column button. You can also double click. So now we're in even more complex settings. Let me orient you to this tab and mention a bonus comment, then we'll zero in on the date range. So the column heading is under your control. And what I like to do, this is a column intended to show actuals, or you call it activity or some other language. But I like to use these dynamic dates. So I always like to bring this up. Again, keeping with the theme, I really do not want to keep altering the setup of this report every time I run it. Certainly, I do not want to type in a date here. Now, why wouldn't I want to do that? Because I want the system to prove to me that what I'm seeing in this column actually came from the time frame I requested, which is on the next tab. So in these financial statements, there are formula fields. You'll see the buttons below, start date and end date. And all I really did was I went in here and I just used the button to bring in start date and then end date to add in the next row. But that gives me some confidence that the system, that the activity I'm seeing will be the time frame I expected. So I do like that particular setting. And it's really helpful too with the relative date situation, because now I know, yeah, it really is working here. Okay. So let's take a look at the date range. And I want to make a couple of general comments. So this is my first column. This is not the relative date column, but this is what we'll call my baseline column. And I like to point out some settings here that not everyone in my experience is aware of. So I'm using the very last option in this dropdown, fiscal year to last fiscal period, one of my favorite report settings for columns. So if you think about it, the goal is to save variations of report files based on your workflow. So do you normally, when you close out the period, so this is the month of February, I know it's late in February, but let's say it's a little earlier in February. And so maybe by the 10th of the month or so, you normally have finished up all your adjustment entries and reconciliation for the prior period. And that's the time when you want to run a regular income statement. Well, if that's true, then what you're really saying is, okay, I want, and if you want to show the entire year so far, I want to look at, the fiscal year so far through last month. Well, let's take advantage of the setting in the system. Why would I want to come in here and have to go all through the trouble I just went through to change the date to be February 28th or March 31st? Let the system work for you. And there are other similar settings. You can narrow it down to, specific fiscal periods. I want periods 1 through 7, but even then you might have to change them. So I do like to suggest, take a look at every option. Make sure you learn what is available to you, and then use the setting that will save you the most time. So certainly you could use last period if I'm just doing a monthly column, but I was choosing specifically that fiscal year today. Okay, so I think that's a good little tour there of make sure you use settings that work well for you and save you keystrokes. Okay, I'm gonna click OK. Now I could have gone to the next column from there, but I want to specifically go. So you'll notice the fourth column is specifically saying it's a year earlier. Okay, that's interesting. So let's take a look. On the date range tab, you see something completely different from what you saw last time. So let's back up for a second here. So in the list of choices for dates, you will see relative range as one of the choices. So it's right after specific range. And if you do not see that option, then it's not available in that report. What I will say is like all the financial statements, except maybe I think the statement of cash flows doesn't have it, but pretty much they all do. So we choose relative range. And then you establish, well, what is the base column? What's my starting point to figure out the relative date? So I only really have one column to choose from, but if we said, okay, take a look at column 3. And then you can go backwards or forwards. So I've got plus or minus. You can do a count, and I know this is grayed out right now, but you can choose fiscal years, you can choose months. So you have some flexibility here. And so once I do that, I say, okay, I want to go back, I want to minus 1 full year. All right, now let's think about that in the context of what we did a moment ago. Now this time I'm going to use my previous column just to go back and kind of cement this in your minds. I know some people might say, well, why don't you just choose last year for the setting? Well, wait a minute. I chose a setting that said fiscal year to last fiscal period. So in March, when I run this report, it'll be for February, and I don't want to change this date. So this report will automatically sync to show me through the end of February once my workstation, the calendar advances into the month of March. Well, I can't use last year. Like I can't say, okay, last year through March. Oh, wait a minute, I have to change it every month. So by using the relative range, or excuse me, the relative date, I don't have to worry about the fact that, well, I actually used a setting that's going to change every month without me changing it. So let's let this setting do the same thing. I think it's especially helpful. The situations where I've most often needed it is when someone wants to go back, say, 2 years, because you don't really have a regular date range option, like go back 2 years ago. Like you'd have to pick a specific year and then you have to keep changing and it gets messy. So I'm a big fan of this particular setting. So you pretty much seen the basics. So you pick a base column and then you establish, am I going forward or backwards in time? And then is it years or months? That's pretty much it. So then when I go to preview, now I don't have a lot of activity in this particular database, and it's going to look very similar from year to year because we just kind of do that as we, use this to demo stuff. But basically, because I'm using those dynamic formula field date fields in the column heading, now I can verify, and this, by the way, this database uses calendar year as the fiscal year. So this will show me my first column is 2021, my second column is 2020. And I should have set this to portrait. I didn't do that. I'm doing landscape. Let me mention a bonus feature. Some of you may be aware of this, but you'll notice on the left, I'm getting roll-ups with language like contributions and grants. And that begs the question, well, where's that coming from? So that's related to what's called a visual chart organizer. And you can set up a visual chart organizer to do those groupings, and you just specify in the VCO, well, what accounts belong in which group, and you create the labels and everything else. But you can also simply change the report to expand. I go up what we call a level. And when I go back to preview, I'll be able to see the individual accounts underneath that. So it's a great little feature. I believe we've done a session before on VCOs, but I know we'll make sure we have a topic for that one. But I do like that VCO setting. So back to where we started. The relative date allows you to position a base column and then go in forward or backwards in time. Now the same, excuse me, I'm going to change this to portrait while I'm thinking about it. The same setting is available in a balance sheet. So let's just take a look. Again, it pretty much looks the same, but let's just do one from scratch here. So this is a balance sheet, and the balance sheet uses an as of date. And right now I've set this one up to be this year, last fiscal period. So if I want to go ahead and add another column, I could just do repeat column, which saves me a little time here. So I'll repeat the column. This is now column 4. So you'll see actual as of. But for the date range, now I can go back and use relative range and say, we'll go back to column 3. Now the background, I haven't saved this column yet, so you don't see it listed in the background. But column 3, and let's go back 1 year, but you'll see I can do periods or years, like I said before. And that's it. It's that simple. So now my balance sheet will also allow me to do the comparisons to prior years or periods or whatever makes sense for what you're doing. I remember one time I had a customer that I think they had done landscape with legal size and did like 13 columns. So they had like all each month, but then they wanted a column that kind of was relative to one of their months or something like that. I just vaguely remember that. But anyway, so the relative range really helped quite a bit with that. And there we are. Now, again, you'll see similar numbers because of our little sample database here, but you'll see the dynamic dates at the top. So let's just take a few minutes. And by the way, if you have questions, just put them in the chat. But let's take a few minutes. I'm going to switch over to WebView. It is actually a slightly different sample database, but that doesn't matter. I'm going to switch over to WebView. So for those of you using Financial Edge NXT, of course, you use your Blackbaud ID to log in and then navigate to your particular database. You have more than one or whatever. And the reporting is consolidated across all of the modules, but it is the same reports that you save in database view. They're interchangeable. I will mention that this was a local database that I had, so the databases themselves are a little bit different. So this is a different report file, but I'm using it just to illustrate that if it were the same database and I was using database view, it would be identical in name and all that kind of stuff. But I have an example here, and I mainly want to do two things. I want to show you how the settings look in WebView, and then just make a couple comments about WebView for those who aren't familiar with it. So in WebView, when you navigate to a report, if you click on the name of the report, you're taken into edit mode. You can also do that directly from the ellipsis. So I'm going to go into edit mode. And it's pretty much the same information that you just saw a moment ago in the database view. It's just presented differently as tiles. So what was on tabs and sections of tabs become tiles. So headings and footers, they come from the format tab back in the report. The general section is also on that's actually the general tab that we saw earlier with the VCO, the Visual Chart Organizer. Some of these settings are from the format tab, but here are the columns. And in this example, I've already gone ahead and added in the piece here, but this one's arranged a little bit differently. So I have the this column 4 is looking at the current year, and then column 3 is going back a little bit. So let's just take a look at each of those. So if I go to column 4, well, this will be the base, if you will. And I scroll down, you'll see this is set for fiscal year to last fiscal period, the similar setting that you saw in my other example. Now, if I go back to column 3 and take a look at the settings, I choose relative range in the dropdown. This is the same dropdown that was in database view. I make it relative to column 4 because that was where I'm going in a different direction. My first column will be a year ago. The second one of actuals will be the current year. And then I'm doing -1. So it's the same identical settings, just presented slightly differently. All right, so just as easy in both views. I will do a little commercial for WebView, especially when it comes to reports. And that's just to mention, I'm going to cancel out of here for a moment, but I want to show you the preview is really nice for reports. In fact, I should probably just go into that. Let me just do that. Let me just walk through the process. When you run a report, you get the blue tile, the blue pop-up tile that basically says, hey, I'm running the report. And then once the report is available, this will turn green. And then we can open the preview. The preview is very nice in WebView. It's much cleaner looking than in database view. And then you have export options. You can go directly into PDF, but the export to Excel works really well. And I'll close this out by just showing you this example. I added a couple of other fancy features in this one for year to date with the multi-column headings and everything. But whatever you're seeing in preview, when you use the WebView version of export to Excel, will be identically presented in Excel. That was always an issue in database view. It was using Crystal Reports and it got messy. Let me go ahead and export to Excel. Now, it'll probably open another monitor and I'll pull it over in just a second here. What's it doing to me? That normally it doesn't do that. Well, let's just do this. It's downloading, I guess because of one of my browser settings here. So let me just stick this. Normally it doesn't do this. So let's see. Sorry, bear with me here just for a second. Thank you. Let's do that. All right, so let me go ahead and open this up. I'll pull it over. It's opening up another monitor. So just give me a second here and I'll bring it over. But I mainly wanted to show you how nice and clean the export to Excel is. So I'll magnify this a little bit, but you know, column for column, row for row, it looks exactly like the preview, which is really nice. None of those extra columns and rows that you get in the messy database view export. And so going back to the list of our topics for today. So just to recap, we've talked about what a relative date is. We've looked at, basically it's the financial statements. So in general ledger financial statements, except for like the statement of cash flows, you know, the balance sheets, the income statements, the project financial statements under project reports, those all have the relative dates. And then we looked examples of how to use them, the settings and the look and feel in both database view and web view. So this concludes our discussion of relative dates for today. I will hang around for a little bit, and you're welcome to use the chat if you want to shoot over a question, and I'll be glad to answer them.